welcome to New York Society Library's virtual presentation. The library is doing a tremendous job of carrying on despite the virus. The first time the library had to close was during the Revolutionary War, and that lasted 14 years. We're hoping this won't last as long. And we hope you will continue to give generously to the library during these challenging times. We are continuing to have our great series of talks, and I hope you will sign up for them. Some highlights, aside from tonight's program, are Leo Damrush's wonderful book, The Club, about Johnson, Boswell, and the friends who shaped an age. We also have a wonderful series of Black Lives Matter programs, which will be coming up. Robert Haas's 80th birthday celebration, and a new translation of Virgil. Tonight, we are very lucky to have Kevin Kwan speaking about his new book, Sex and Vanity. To interview him, we have Jackie Weld. Jackie is a lawyer and the author of 2 books. First, the definitive biography of Peggy Guggenheim, and Rara Avis, a wonderful novel which I am proud to have published. She is known to many as an accomplished interviewer. Kevin is the author of the best-selling Crazy Rich Asians, later made into a fabulous movie. It was a relief for me to leave the grim world of the COVID and enter Kevin's dazzling world. I was totally distracted and entertained. I loved the description of Capri, where Alex and I went with Kevin. We were thrilled to have been mentioned in the book. Kevin took us into the other world of Capri, not the tourist spots, but special places known only to the locals. The book is an intoxicating update of A Room with a View, with a lot more sex in it. And Kevin says A Room with a View is his favorite book. The book has received rapturous reviews from, among others, The Atlantic, Kirkus, and Publishers Weekly. And now, let us welcome Jackie Weld.
Hello, everybody. I'm so looking forward to having this conversation with Kevin, who has been friends of my whole family, really, for now many, many years. And we've followed his progress with great happiness, as if he's just one of our extended family.
Hello,
Hi,
hello.
Kevin.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you. It's much earlier in the afternoon where you are now. We miss you in
I
New
wish
York.
I could be in New York at the library with you and with Jeanette. And I just want to take a moment to thank Jeanette for that lovely introduction. And wish we could all be in Capri together, actually.
Oh, I can't wait to. I wasn't there the last time, so I'm ready. And yes, thank you, Jeanette. I love your introduction. It's so marvelous. But anyway, Kevin, we know your wonderful series of bestsellers, which we have all enjoyed, and this last one, Sex and Vanity, which is just fabulous. You can't put it down. But tell me, why are we fascinated with the crazy rich?
I mean, that's a good question, isn't it? I think it's human nature. I think it really began back in the days of the cavemen, when we were all sharing a cave. And whoever had that choice spot at the very back of the cave with the most beautiful pelt of, animal fur, I think was the privileged, king of the tribe, wouldn't you say? And we've always been fascinated with kings of the tribes. And so it's continued through literary history, from the Bible to Machiavelli, to Jane Austen, to Trollope, to Edith Wharton. We've always been fascinated to learn more about the foibles of the privileged and the powerful.
As you said, running through the entire book is a commentary on status and snobbery and all the things that go with it. And I think that is the fascination with the extremely rich. And you want to ask the question, which is apocryphal, that Fitzgerald said, are the rich different? Yeah. From you and me, yes, said Hemingway, they have more money. Now, you said in writing this book, you were trying to bring yourself escape and joy. Jeanette touched on some of it in your wonderful descriptions and divine locations in Capri. But what did you mean by that?
Well, I'm always trying to channel joy in all my books. You know, for me, number one, as a writer, I'm trying to create an atmosphere that will bring joy to the reader, that they'll enjoy and escape and really be entertained and amused by the book. That's really my first goal. But then also it brings joy to myself when I do write these books. You know, Crazy Rich Asians was written actually right after my father passed away. And I was not expecting on writing, you know, Comedy of Manners. I was, in fact, planning on writing a very angry diatribe. What happened and what came out of my, you know, what happened from the brain to the fingertips, however, something happened, you know, that switched it up. And I've caught on to that style ever since. And so similarly, last year was a very frustrating year for me. I was doing a lot of work in Hollywood and writing for TV and trying to get projects off the ground. And at a certain point, I just got so fed up with the process of working, you know, with Hollywood executives that I said, you know what, I'm just going to take some time off and go back to what I love to do best, which is write a book where I am completely the god of the book. And I can't have 20 executives telling me, oh, change this line, change that line. You know, can we have the setting be a little more colorful or less colorful or whatever it is? And I really found joy in escaping back into just the simplicity of writing a novel.
And we have as well this new book, and you might be able to tell us better what it's about, but essentially it's, as you say, a comedy of manners in which a girl, it's a love story, Lucy Churchill, yes, one of those Churchills, half Chinese and half wasps, is torn between two cultures and two men, the fiancé her family would like her to have, and her true love that she fears is unacceptable, George, not least because he appeared in a white Speedo in front of her friends and because he too is Chinese. So why did you choose, the story begins with a wedding in Capri. Why did you choose Capri to start the action?
You know, as we've mentioned from the beginning, this is an homage to A Room with a View, E.M. Forster's classic, you know, beautiful novel. And his story begins in Florence. And so, number one, I wanted to shake things up. I wanted to still be in Italy, but I thought we'd leave Florence behind and be in a beautiful, captivating island like Capri. My initial idea for titling this book, I was going to call it Ocean View Room instead of A Room with a View. Because, you know, what do people mainly argue about or get mad about when they go to hotels if they don't have a proper view? And of course, you know, these oceanside retreats, it's always like, oh, does my room have a sea view? So that's sort of the initial idea and the seed of why I wanted to sort of set it on this beautiful island. I felt it would be fun and sexy.
And as you said, oh, amazing. Your descriptions, as Jeanette said, are delicious. We know where to go get sandals. When I read about the couple, the friends having croissant on the croissant and cappuccinos on the terrace, I was just so tremendously envious. You said that atmosphere is everything, and this one does abound, the book in atmosphere. When did your love of travel and food begin?
Even before I could remember, I think I've been a lover of food and travel. You know, I grew up on the island of Singapore, and Singapore, I've always said, is the original foodie country. It's a tiny island where there's absolutely nothing to do. It's so boring. So the only sport is food and finding the best places to eat. So even growing up as a little child, we would eat 5 meals a day. I kid you not. We would have breakfast, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, and then supper. And a lot of them at different places. So I always loved going out to eat in different places all the time, even from a very young age. And then, of course, traveling. You know, my parents took me along with them as a baby and growing up, going to fabulous places all over the world.
Yes, and how did you hone your descriptive talents? Because reading your book is like being there. Absolutely. You taste the food, you see the vista, you see the party, you're there. You said you're not creative, but that you are an observer and that you've been an observer your whole life. Do you think your background as a photographer helped hone your eye?
I mean, that's a wonderful observation, Jackie. I think very much so. I think I have a visual eye and a visual way of writing. And in fact, back when I was in creative writing school in college, I would write a lot of poems. And my poetry instructor, he called me the designer poet, which wasn't meant to be a compliment. It was kind of a double-edged sword to be called the designer poet, because even back then I was using words or inventing words like Armani-esque in poems, and sort of even then at age 17.
Like you did at Barney.
So it's always been a thread. And of course, after creative writing school, I went to art school. I moved to New York and went to Parsons. So it really does inform my work. And, also I've done travel writing. So, you put all of those three together, and I'm just trying to describe a place to the degree that you just want to be there. Hopefully.
And you really do it so well, because as you pointed out, you're a very visual writer. And that's why we can be there in the time and place, and why they're so wonderfully escapist, really, your novels. And when we can sit in bed and say, oh, yes, I too can have a Ferrari. You set the action in motion with an invitation to the wedding of a crazy rich Taiwanese heiress in Capri. Why do weddings lend themselves to so much excess?
I think weddings are the ultimate social circus in a way. It's really where families and friends come together. And it's really, for many, many people, I think it's a social climbing opportunity. It's a chance to show off. It's a chance for the family to flaunt their wealth and their connections and their access. And you especially see that in Asia, in Southeast Asia and in China and in India. People practically mortgage their whole lives just to put on the splashiest wedding. Of course, my characters did not have to do that. They are the Taiwan plastics shoes. And it's a nod to characters that were in Crazy Rich Asians. So they can afford to put on this really lavish, but hopefully elegant wedding.
Absolutely. And my family's from South America, where lavish weddings are also de rigueur. Weddings of 1,000 people are not unheard of. And I think around the world, I've heard of extraordinary weddings in India and all kinds of different places. Americans are no slouches either when they really want to put on the dog. But now really, how rich are these people? You said somewhere that there are so many true stories that you had to tone down because nobody would believe them. So I'm sort of curious, what true stories of excessive behavior can you give us a couple of examples of the ones that were so over the top? You don't need to name names.
Well, I mean, of course I will never ever name names, but I mean, I really do happen to know someone who has a shark pond in the middle of their living room, for example. And of course, there's these fish collectors, who get plastic surgery. They get facelifts for their exotic fish, just so they'll have the perfect visage, And then, there are the stories of these week-long weddings taking place in multiple cities across Europe or across Asia, that cost, I think one of the most expensive weddings I read about, this was one I did not know, but I actually read about it in the papers, was a $90 million wedding thrown by a Chinese magnate for his daughter, which took place in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Sydney.
Oh my goodness. One is fascinated by the crazy wealth in Asia, but in your book, there's a crazy American too. Cecil, the fiance of the family's dreams, proposes to her with this outlandish flash mob on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum, which had ballet dancers, Cirque du Soleil, and all kinds of other over-the-top examples. And then he presents her with a $26.5 million ring that he himself has designed. There are not that many of those out there. And if they are, so how different do you think the American crazy rich are from, let's say, the Asian crazy rich? It's a stupid question.
Well, these days I think not so different. I mean, not so different at all. And I think Cecil, for me, exemplifies that sort of, the nouveau tech money that's going about buying entire islands in Hawaii, for example, and creating their own private little fiefdoms and buying up all this real estate all over the world and creating, their own sort of pandemic shelters. I heard recently about someone in the Hamptons that has built an entire surgery suite in her house with her own private ventilator and all the accoutrements, should she get ill. So I think the crazy rich are everywhere, quite frankly.
But what's funny, you'd think that she wanted that surgical outpost for her plastic surgery, which some people do with great alacrity. You have suggested, though, that there's very little originality among the 1%.
Well, that seems to be the case, more and more so. I love celebrating eccentrics and people who really go out on the limb to create original lives, like Peggy Guggenheim, for example. She was a true original, but I think these days, so many of the people in that sort of international wealth club, they're all keeping up with the same Joneses. It's the same 300 Joneses from all around the world. So they all want to live in the same areas. They all want to collect the same artists. They all want to join the same boards. It's a world I think quite well.
Yes, indeed.
And hopefully they'll give lots of money to Casino Maria.
Oh boy. And I do think, actually, for all the fun we poke at some of these things, is they're real acts of generosity. It's, including your friends and in giving them a wonderful time. The root of that is generosity and showing off, of course. But it is an act of grace. Well,
I always say, when I'm doing book tours and I'm on the lecture circuit, that Americans are still, some of the most generous people in the world. And private philanthropy, private fundraising is really what drives the entire charitable landscape of this country. So I think that's very commendable.
Absolutely. I wrote a piece once that to be someone in New York society, you do have to be allied to a charity. In New York society is not about just giving parties. You have to have parties that are for the good of someone. And that's why the social circuit is so very, very involved with charities, which you do mention in your book, of people trying to get into the right charities and not. But many of the characters in your book, along the lines we've been discussing, are focused on status symbols, in particular status symbols and particular brands. Can you give us a bit of a rundown on what those brands tend to be?
I think there are so many, but, there are certain coveted jewelers, for example, that everyone wants jewels commissioned by, Jar being one of them, Carnet being another one of them. There are certain, I think now these days, everyone wants to work with the star architects, the special architects who get to build them, their compounds or their private museums and things like that. So, people like Axel Vervoet and that lot, I think I have, I sort of really have fun just sort of gently satirizing Cecil, for example, who's so obsessed with architecture and design that he commissions 3 different architects just to design his townhouse in the West Village. And
the townhouse has a gondola in the middle of the living room, if I recall, or is it a canal?
It's a Venetian canal and a gondola, of course, and a full-time gondolier who doubles as a bodyguard. So
amazing. But no, and I have seen the excess in the decorating, the size of the McMansion has been around for a while. How they're very often graceless, but nevertheless. Your book has been called a dizzily shopaholic comedy. As Jeanette said, where to get the best of everything and love shopping, I believe. And your descriptions of couture and designers are delicious. So when were you always interested in design and in couture and in some of these wonderful toys?
I was, and I think it really started at a very early age, because I was the youngest. I was sort of the baby of the family, and my mother and her sisters, like she comes from a family of she had 5 sisters, actually, and they were all sort of fabulous shoppers. And so, they would go around the world shopping, and I was the one that was tagged along always. And so I remember so much of my youth was spent in jewelry shops, in boutiques, in in Paris or London, and I would be the little kid in the corner asleep underneath the jewelry booth as my aunties were just, looking at things and shopping. I once went shopping with my mom and her friends, and I clocked in. I had to give up after 14 hours, but they kept on
Oh
going.
my.
So yeah,
Oh
so I do
my.
come from a family of shoppers.
You learned
Yeah,
by
I learned by
osmosis.
osmosis, and so I think always had that eye, but I also had the interest, in photography, in art, and so I went to art school, and that's where I really
And
sort of
beauty.
honed my interest in all aspects of design.
And beauty. And you were, if I recall, when I first met you too, you were designing books. That was part of your
Absolutely, yeah. I was a design
resume.
consultant. I worked on Elizabeth Taylor's book of jewelry, for example. So that was a fun project.
Yeah. Oh gosh, and I have your book here. I Am Cuba, I think is what it was called. And now, one of the things I love is your footnotes, because we learn a lot through your book. It's not just all what somebody said, a meringue, a frothy meringue of fun, which it is, because I learned more about certain types of products. I learned a lot of insider information. I learned, for example, that no true Italian dips his bread in olive oil. And what I found wonderful, I learned that there's a body paint combination at Bentley called Meteor over Fountain Blue Bentley Mulsanne, but that you, the writer, personally preferred Silver Tempest over Damn Sunny. This is the kind of stuff you don't learn just anywhere. And then the cars are so amusing as well. I think it's Cecil who comes in with a 1973 Ferrari Ding 240 GTS, which we learned, Dino, excuse me, which we learned was named after Ferrari's son, Dino, and would cost upwards of $400,000. I just thought all this stuff is so amazing. And even when you get to New York, there's tons of insider knowledge. And just like you were talking about jewelry, you refer to Joel, which only a few know is the real name of Jar, Joel being the owner. And then your beautiful, lush descriptions of the Carlisle. Now, do you have help researching any of the descriptions if you're not in that particular town? Or do you more or less
I don't really do any
yourself?
research at all. This all comes from my crazy scrambled brain. Like I think I have like Seinfeld's brain, because I have all this useless information I find that ends up in my books. And yeah.
You kept giving. You tell writers to just do it, to go to yourselves, because that your books are so quintessentially you. And that's why they're so much fun, because you are so much fun. The humor in the book is phenomenal. And the hardest thing on earth to do is to set about writing humor. And you said you don't intend them to be funny, but they wind up being funny. How so?
I don't know. I think I really am just an observer. And I think I see myself as almost like a journalist when I create scenes.
Yeah.
But so much of the time, I'm observing what I find is ridiculous. So it does come across, I think, as hopefully entertaining and amusing. And we're poking gentle fun here, as you know. Like, I have no axes to grind whatsoever. I'm just looking at the foibles of society, how we behave, how we demarcate ourselves, how we stratify ourselves, how we judge ourselves. And hopefully within that, there are truths that will be taken, that will be, useful.
And you're so right. When I mentioned the Speedo, it really is because here's Lucy seeing for the first time the man that she is very attracted to, without giving away the story. And she judges him by the white Speedo. I know many women who judge their potential date suitors by what they wear.
Exactly. And there's a cultural difference here, because she's grown up in a very waspy and slightly repressed world. I mean, she's a Burley girl, right? So,
I know some of those.
They don't spend too much time around guys in Speedos, put it this way. But he is an Australian surfer lifesaver. And so to him, he's wearing a piece of athletic wear. It's functional, it's
And looking
utilitarian,
good.
and he looks good in it. And
Well, speaking about her waspy background, there's a lot of old money versus new money, which of course is the great themes of so many writers like Edith Wharton, Henry James, you, and you said you were influenced by Dominic Dunn and Tom Wolfe. How so?
well, I really sort of lapped up their books, back when they were writing all of them. People Like Us was one of my favorite novels when it was first published in the
Loved
80s, and that, to me, he really did a number on New York society with that book. Wouldn't you agree? But he
Absolutely.
did spill secrets, and he did have access to grind, and that was very different, I think, than what I do. And then, of course, Tom Wolfe,
It's true.
with Bonfire of the Vanities, his was really a collision of all the different classes that make up New York City, that make it so fascinating. And so I've always been really sort of inspired by the great satirists. Let's not forget Edith Wharton, the custom of the country
No, exactly.
today.
I mean,
Yeah.
she's writing about this, and Trollope is writing exactly about this. These newcomers coming into society with much more money than the oldies, and the old money really being worried about their loss of status. And in America, truly, the old families didn't have huge fortunes. And as you said, now we've got the billionarials. What was that coinage that came up?
Billionaire millennials, which, for better or for worse, they do exist.
Well, thank God somebody has money. We were talking about wasp snobism and the fact that Lucy is torn between this pull towards their snobbery and who she might ultimately be happier with. And at one point, Cecil, the fiancé, realizes that no matter how much money he has, he'll never be accepted. But one of the things in the book is her waspy grandmother is always referring to her as her little China doll. And as you said, that's a paper cut many times over.
It is. And it's I think it's something that's also very generational. Her grandmother doesn't mean to be racist in calling her that. It's really a term of endearment. But she's really a woman of a different era. So she's not with it to what is appropriate in this day and age. And she also doesn't realize that by singling out her beloved granddaughter, who she really does love, and singling out her beautiful Asiatic features, that she's actually adding to the girl's complex. So, and
yes, so it's not totally accepted, but then she herself is a snob about her own heritage because she wants to downplay the Chinese side and not fall in love with another Chinese.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes all ways, and so she has a subconscious internal racism towards herself, which I think is also very specific to a lot of biracial Americans. I grew up with many cousins, for example, who are biracial, who have mothers or fathers who are English or Australian or American. And so I was able to really see the identity struggle that they had, growing up as being half Chinese and also half white. And it was always very interesting to see who did better than the other in terms of navigating these waters. And it was also very specific to how they were brought up, who their parents were, what values were emphasized, which cultures were celebrated, so on and so forth. And so I wanted to bring light to that.
Yeah, I thought that was a very compelling part of the book because it really had this serious side of exploring the roots of these snobberies, if you will, and bringing them to light. Yeah, well, you said that there's snobbery everywhere. The Chinese, you were going to discuss also, I wanted to talk about the oh yeah, I know, the assimilationist pull, when you say, people have said, well, aren't you going to fix your eyes? Are you going to fix your nose? Did you get a lot of that? Is that a lot of what goes on in some of these people who are not quite comfortable with who they are?
Well, I think it is, of course, very relative to the person. But it's interesting to see the influence of colonial culture on countries like Hong Kong and Singapore. I remember visiting Hong Kong once as a teenager, and a relative saying to me, "Oh, you're really good looking from here down." But
Oh,
you
boy.
can fix your eyes, and I should take you to see my surgeon. And and I was just appalled because I was like, well, I very much like my eyes. I don't feel like I need to get them cut up and have a double eyelid, But I realized this person had been indoctrinated into feeling that, the icon of beauty is someone with big eyes. The icon of beauty is someone like Elizabeth Taylor, for example. And it's interesting. Even now in Asia, you see now the rise of cosmetic surgery in places like South Korea and China, and the westernization of the features. They all want to look like these very sculpted, skin whitened, big eyed, Korean pop star types. And
Well, their desire for assimilation that immigrants have. And, I was going to ask you too, because you grew up in Singapore, surrounded by the crazy rich. You said you played with a kid whose family had a plane in their garage. And then you're transported to Texas. And I wanted to ask you, what was that like?
It was, for me, I think I was lucky because I left when I was 11 years old. So by 11, I really had a sense of self and a sense of self-confidence. And I was, living, of course, in a country that was also very multicultural and very cosmopolitan. I grew up with neighbors who were from England and New Zealand and India, all over the world. We were like a sort of UN neighborhood. So for me to move to Texas, it wasn't that much of a culture shock, to be in a school with white kids, for example. I didn't see them as any better or any more special than I was. So I was able to assimilate, very, very quickly and very easily in a way that I think many other Asian immigrants and immigrants from around the world are not able to when they come to this country. So I was really fortunate in that sense. But I was, if anything, I was appalled by being in Texas. Here I was, I'd come from a very international city that was sort of like the Manhattan of Asia. And suddenly I was in suburban Texas, where you'd go out on the street and you'd see just houses and houses and houses, no one on the streets. Empty houses, empty lawns. That was the culture shock for me, just the difference in the lifestyle.
Yeah. And I was thinking too, so many immigrants, and in your case, it would have been, I think, applicable. They are somebody where they come from. You came from a family of wealth. You came from a legacy of achievement and renown. And then you move to the United States and nobody knows who you are. And they, even worse, could care less because there's so little sort of respect for those legacies. Did you have any sense of that? Or how did
I was too young to care, quite frankly. Number one, I was 11 years old, so I didn't have any of those issues. My issue was surviving till lunchtime without getting shoved into a locker, by a big, beefy Texan football player, who was 10 times the size of me. But I think I was lucky in the sense that, my parents, came here as people of means. They came and, they already had business interests in real estate in Texas. And of course, being English speaking also helps, my mother just is popular wherever she goes. So she immediately made friends and, exactly. So she, they're also very comfortable moving between East and West. My father was educated in Australia and spent 10 years there. So if anything, for him, having grown up in a family where his father and his grandfather were so distinguished, he loved moving to Texas and being anonymous. And he loved being just who he was, not the son of so-and-so or the grandson of so-and-so. So that was his reason for wanting to leave Singapore,
Interesting. You said your books are about family, the extended families that, especially the Asian extended family. And I see and the role of the matriarch. Would you make a comment? Because you also have Rosemary as just a character in your book referred to as an auntie. What would that mean in Asian culture?
Well, it's a mark of respect in in a lot of the Southeast Asian cultures to, whenever you meet an elder, whether it's a man or a woman, to call them auntie or uncle if they're a friend of the family. So they don't necessarily actually have to be related to you as an actual aunt or uncle. But, you know, after meeting them for the first time, the polite thing to do is to start addressing them as auntie and uncle. So that's just...
And aunties are expected to behave how?
Aunties are expected to behave how? You know, I think depending on the culture, you know, there's a certain level of decorum that one usually sort of portrays. But Rosemary, of course, as you can see from my book, she doesn't play by the rules. She is a colorful, flamboyant, sort of Auntie May-esque character that sort of exists outside of the norm.
Yeah, and wildly rich as well.
Having money helps, right?
Tell me
to be
something.
eccentric.
Yeah, I know you are fascinated by royalty, and you say, explain to us how that comes about and where that comes, where does
I mean,
that
once
start
again,
for you?
you know, I grew up in Singapore, which was until the 50s a British crown colony. So the colonial influence was always there. And the respect for the British royalty. You know, my grandfather was knighted by the Queen. And so growing up, we always had, you know, sort of the big plaques and all the different awards he had displayed in the house that were signed by Queen Elizabeth at the top. You know, she always signed at the very top of her documents. She never signed on the bottom because she never is at the bottom, you know. So she countersigns her official decrees at the very top. And Philip signs at the bottom, quite actually. So that's an interesting kind of metaphor, isn't it?
Very interesting that
exactly.
we wouldn't have
So,
known. Well, we don't even want to bring up the two royals hanging around and
but so there was always that respect and that interest. And so, of course, you know, when Princess Diana got married, was it 1980, 1981? I remember, you know, it was a family occasion. We all woke up at, was it 3 a.m. in the morning in Singapore, and everyone huddled around the TV, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, myself. And at that point, I knew very little about Diana. But the minute she walked down the aisle, you know, I fell in love. And yeah.
We did all of us did. It was a fairy tale wedding.
It was the start of royalty as celebrity. I think she officially launched that, you know, because never before had that been so much interest, I think, in that global way.
Well, she was beautiful. But, you know, there are magazines like Ola, for example, which is one of the biggest circulating magazines in the world. And they would concentrate on royalty because royalty had status that was universal to their readership. And coming to America was hard for them because we didn't have the equivalent of royalty. People that everybody would recognize as being part of this higher strata. So I thought that was sort of an interesting thing. But tell me now, you've been so wildly successful, as you well know. The trilogy, the movie, the bestsellers. Tell me, how has success changed your life?
You know, that's a very interesting question because in many ways it has, and in many ways it hasn't. I remember talking to a few different movie star friends who would say that at the point they were most famous, you know, when they would star in some huge breakout movie or were on the cover of Vanity Fair or whatever, that was also the time they were the most depressed. Because they realized, okay, now I'm famous and now I have more money than I ever need. Now what? You know, they really had to confront their own personal demons. For me, you know, having the success of being an author hasn't changed my life in that way. You know, if anything, it's enriched my life because I feel like with this new platform, I've been able to really help engage in causes that I feel strongly about. I've met some amazing people. I've had access to meeting some other amazing people, like Jane Goodall, for example, who is one of my idols. So I've enjoyed some of those fringe benefits in terms of, you know, having a voice, having a platform. What's scary is fame. You know, as a writer, you don't ever expect that you'll be famous enough to be recognized on the streets. And in some places I am. And that's always very, very strange and disconcerting. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be, I would imagine, because, you know, writers too are so internal. you're spending all your time with yourself, laughing at your good
Mhm.
jokes. Some people like
Yeah.
some of us.
I
do
mean,
that when we're
I'm really an
thinking,
introvert, quite frankly, and I'm forced to do things like be on a public forum with you, and I've learned through practice. No,
Not
I mean
so
it's
bad.
a lot of fun, and it's actually a lot more fun on Zoom where I can hide in my little room and just talk to you on screen. But I still do, get very nervous in big public events. And I wonder, like, why is the spotlight even on me? So it's a very surreal state of affairs. But on the whole, I feel very fortunate, that all this has happened.
Is the movie business fun? You're now spending a lot of time in LA and in the movie business, honing, producing your upcoming films. Is it fun or is it?
It's equal
nerve-wracking?
parts fun and torture, I would have to say. I'm not only am I doing films, I'm also, I'm writing and creating several TV series and also unscripted documentary series. So I have a whole production company that's doing many different projects. And
Wow.
It's interesting in that it's allowed me to really explore all these different things I'm interested in. But it's never fun when you have to have your work so scrutinized and so kind of, futzed with by corporate executives with no creativity, and that's for some cases, of course. There are some projects where I absolutely love the teams, love the executives, so it's a mixed bag, but it's interesting to sort of play in those waters and to discover what Hollywood is about and how it operates as a town. It's a culture unlike any other, I have to say. And so it's just this beautiful, bizarre world that I'm just, sort of having an adventure in. Let's see how long it lasts, right?
Maybe you'll see where your next book will be based. Speaking of which, are you going to write more books like Sex and Vanity? Is this going to be a trilogy?
It is. It's a very unconventional trilogy in the sense that Lucy's story is now complete. We've finished her story, and there is going to be a next book, but it's very much what I call a cities trilogy. It's inspired by different cities. So this was the New York story. The next book will be the London story, and the third and final book in the trilogy will be the Paris story. So it's like a Chanel bottle, New York, London, Paris, in a way. And it's my Valentine to each of these three cities, which I love so much. And so you'll see. And each of them are also inspired by different great novels that I love.
That'll be, we're all going to look forward to that. And then I have to say too, are all families crazy? And are all societies snobs?
I'm not the ultimate anthropologist, but in my experience, every family has its own, little degree of crazy to it. And I think that's what makes life so fun, right? And there is snobbery, I think, in every culture that I know of. Perhaps there is some culture out there in some tribe that's completely egalitarian, but as far as I know, there's always a pecking order, no matter what. There's always a village elder.
That's right. And we're always. Now, I don't know from the powers that be if we have more time or whether this is it. But otherwise, I'd ask you, what is it like to bring out a book in the middle of a pandemic where your book tour is on Zoom?
It's been both a privilege to actually be able to do this on Zoom, because I think we've actually been able to do so many more events than I normally would be able to had I just been touring normally. But at the same time, I do miss being in rooms with people and shaking hands and signing books and getting that exchange, being in a room where people can actually react to what we're saying, either they're chuckling or laughing or rolling their eyes. I miss having that sort of physical encounter, but this seems to be the way it is for the time being, right? So at least we have this, right?
And I think for a writer, people do stimulate you. I mean, that's where you get your ideas. If you can't observe people in action and behaving the way they do, you're losing out on some material.
And it's so funny. It's come to a point where at every public book signing that I do, I'll always meet someone that has some special story they want to share, or some piece of intrigue, or they'll slip me their business card and say, we have to talk because boy, do I have some gossip for you, So I miss that. I miss having these little subversive elements work their way in. Yeah.
And and telling people what should be buying. But anyway, I think I'm happy to have had this wonderful moment with you. And I don't know now if there are people who've been watching who have questions. Sarah, I don't know what's up next.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat, which I might just pitch at, if that's okay. Mostly the chat, thank you folks, is just very positive and people saying this is great and they're really enjoying it. So no surprise, this is a wonderful event. One of our participants asks, they're curious about Kevin's skill at writing comedy and where that came from. You talked about some of your models as observers. How about the comic element?
I have no idea where that skill came from, because really, completely honestly, I feel like when I went to creative writing school, I really honed a talent for very, very serious prose. The biggest influence on my writing really was Joan Didion. And to me, it was all about writing these sort of very surgical, precise, minimalist, devastating little statements in my work. So I never intended to write comedy in this manner, but it just evolved, I guess starting with Crazy Rich Asians. When I began planning and writing these stories, it was the absurdity and those moments of snobbery and bitchery and catfighting that that I sort of gravitated to, and you have to treat those, I think, with really the appropriate grain of salts that they do need. So maybe that's where it began, but it also began, I think, because I do enjoy reading satire so much, from Edith Wharton to Henry James to Tom Wolfe. So I guess it filtered through somehow, but I never really thought I'd be good at it.
I think it's been proved that you sure are, and several people are commenting equivalent things here as well. A question, Kevin, you were great interview, Jackie. Kevin, do you think the present isolation of families may change family dynamics, or could you see yourself addressing the challenges? I'm not quite sure I understand. In a hopefully Junior's way is what we have on the screen here, but
I think it'll be very interesting in terms of how we all change because of this pandemic. I mean, this has been a social experiment unlike any other, I think, in the last few decades. I think back to my grandparents' age, during the war, for example, when Singapore was occupied for 4 years by the Japanese, what they had to go through, being on lockdown for 4 years, and for them, the threat was very physical. At any moment, the troops could just come up your driveway, knock on the door, and take people away. This is a very different moment, but we are all fraught. We all have this anxiety and this fear that this virus could slip through the door and take any one of us away. And I do think it's really changing people in immense ways that we'll only begin to see after this is all over. It's interesting trying to write, because now, I'm working on all these TV shows and we're planning to go into production, the minute we all can. But how can we tell these stories in a meaningful way and make them relevant, knowing what's happened? How do we address the fact that there's been a pandemic and these are characters that are living in a post-pandemic world? We're all trying to figure that out right now and see where it leads us. So we shall see. Thanks for the question, Esty.
So do readers in other countries react differently to your books?
They very much do. I think really it's a matter of where you are and where your perspective is from. I know, for example, when Crazy Rich Asians first came out, there were a lot of people in Singapore that were utterly confused as to what the big deal was, because to them it was boring. To them, this was just, oh yeah, he's describing the island. Why is this interesting to us? And then, for example, I have a lot of fans in the Philippines, And for a while, until I visited the Philippines and met the fans, I didn't really understand why there was such a huge fan base there. And I realized it's because the Filipinos, they really straddle perfectly East and West. You know, it was, of course, a Spanish and a British and an American colony for many years. So they are the most westernized of the Asians. So they got all the American jokes, all the Western jokes that I put into my books, but they also understood all the Asian jokes that were put in. So they became like the super fans in that respect. So it's interesting to see, you know, from culture to culture, how people react to my books. The newest book, Sex and Vanity, I'm told is a huge hit in Germany, of all places. And I'll actually show you the German cover, which they insisted on designing themselves. Yeah.
Oh.
It's very shiny, but it's got a girl, you know, on a yacht. And they actually, the German publishers were appealing to me to change the name of the book. They wanted to call it, I think, Capri Crazy at first, because Capri has a very special place in every German's heart. That's what they told me. I never knew that, but it's apparently a cultural touchstone for all Germans, Capri. You know, eventually they decided to keep the title, but it's, yeah. So yes, different countries have different reactions, and it's really fun to see, you know, what happens from place to place.
And then I'm very happy to have either of our presenters toss in whatever else you'd like to address. But someone asks, what are you reading now? What would you recommend or unrecommend? You
know, I read 5 or 6 books at the same time. I just finished reading a new novel by the novelist Sandy Tan. She's a Singaporean American, and she wrote a book called Lurkers, which Soho Press is publishing next year, I believe, and it's just brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, brilliant, brilliant book. You'll be hearing a lot about it because I think it's going to make a lot of waves. And in the nonfiction space, I just finished a book called The Last Kings of Shanghai, which is a fascinating look at 2 families, the Sassoons and the Kaduris. These were 2 Iraqi Jewish families that moved to China at the turn of the century and were really responsible for creating so much of the commerce and the wealth of China. So it was a fascinating history lesson into, you know, 2 powerful, crazy rich, not so Chinese families. The Kaduris now are better known as the owners of the Peninsula Hotel Group. 2 fun books I've read recently.
Great. So anything else that you'd like to add that hasn't been addressed that you'd like to address about Sex and Vanity or the book world at present or anything else?
I mean, I'll just say it again. You know, I think independent bookstores need all the help they can get. So please, please, please buy books from all the indies, you know, around the nation, your favorite independent bookstores, whether it's in New York or wherever you may be. I'm personally also buying as many books as I can because we all need to support one another at this time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. And I did pop the link to purchase your copy of Sex and Vanity from the Corner Bookstore, which is a great little indie.
Fantastic book.
In
They
the
gave me
chat
my first book party for Sex and Vanity. No, I'm sorry, for Crazy Rich Asians.
Yeah.
So it was a lovely place to read.
Yes, indeed. Good. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everybody, for being here on behalf of the New York Society Library. We're going to close there, and we're going to put on the screen a couple of things that are coming up at the library. So do feel free to join us for any or all of those. You can find our upcoming listings at nysoclib.org/events. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a great pleasure. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all.